I was speaking to my Canadian friend Paul recently. Paul has inspired a couple of essays at guymcpherson.com, and he inspired this video by asking me a question. Quote, if you only had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it? End quote. Among the many things Paul and I have in common is the propensity for lying awake at night, thinking too deeply about things over which we have no control. This is one of the many consequences of being middle-aged in a world disintegrating on our watch. It's no surprise my conversation with Paul led to this question. After all, I've been focusing on living with urgency, living with intention, living with love, and living with death in mind for many years. As a result, some of my friends have followed this path, Paul included. With this short video, I'd like to expand the conversation to include you. If you only had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it? The bigger issue, obviously, is how to live your one short life. Whether you are thinking about 24 hours, 24 days, or 24 years is not the primary point to consider. Rather, I encourage you to consider the relatively short time each of us will spend among the living. How you spend your next 24 seconds probably is not worth as much time to you as how you will spend your next 24 days. The 24-hour timeline probably merits more time than any of us spend on it, in part because we are all busy with active lives focused on what we would like to accomplish in the coming months and years. The topic of 24 days, as opposed to 24 hours, brings to mind a book I co-authored titled Extinction Dialogues, How to Live with Death in Mind. The book was published in 2014, although the first edition was poorly edited and therefore poorly printed, and little read. The 2015 second edition of the book is much better, but it is no longer available, as with the first edition. My co-author and the publisher joined the defamation campaign that removed me from public service. As a result, they also worked to ensure the book is no longer available. The unavailability of the book and how it became unavailable are not the points I'd like to focus on here. Rather, I'd like to focus on that book as an example of focusing one's effort on behalf of the common good. Once we decided to write the book together, we quickly focused on the plan to get it done. Our strategy was to write idea-filled email messages back and forth. For example, I'd come up with an idea, write a bit about it, and send it to my co-author. My co-author would read my latest few paragraphs and respond with comments. These back-and-forth messages became the initial draft of the book. Because we were focused on the topic, and also because we were both driven by our commitment to the common good, the initial draft of the book was finished in fewer than 10 days. Quote, if you only had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it? End quote. Because of the way my relationships with the publisher and the co-author turned out, I would no longer spend 24 hours, much less 10 days, working on this book. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I am pleased with the resulting book, albeit not with the inability of people to read it. This abbreviated version of my short relationship with these two people serves as an example. Lacking complete knowledge of the future, how shall we live? Knowing our time is short on this most beautiful of planets, how shall we spend our valuable time? I had used this same approach a few years earlier in co-authoring a book titled Ms. Ladybug and Mr. Honeybee, A Love Story at the End of Time. The Ladybug book was lead authored by Pauline Panayiotou-Schneider, who was to become my life partner several years after we wrote the book. We took several weeks to write the Ladybug book, which is still available today. Sometimes my co-authors don't turn against me. Sometimes the relationship turns better instead of worse. This was one of those times. Paul's question is a good starting point. Quote, if you only had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it? End quote. Of course, we can be relatively confident that we will live longer than 24 hours. In fact, assuming we have only a day will almost certainly lead to poor decisions about finances and, more importantly, relationships. In other words, the notion of living with urgency must be balanced with a pragmatic approach focused on longer-term survival. Each of us must respond to the 24-hour question based on our own lives and our own outlooks. How I spend every 24-hour period probably has little bearing on how you spend the same amount of time. Nonetheless, the question is certainly worth pondering on a frequent basis. Quote, if you only had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it? End quote. Another question worth thinking about. If you only had 24 days to live, or 24 weeks, or 24 months, how would you spend each of those lengths of time? Maybe that's more than one question. If so, perhaps you can think about each of them. Let's start with 24 hours. It's virtually nothing. If you had your 10th birthday today, then this is your 3,652nd day on Earth. Most people watching this video have experienced more than 10,000 24-hour periods. If you're more than 50 years old, you've lived through considerably more than 18,000 days. Admittedly, very few of those 24-hour periods amount to much. You might remember the dates for half a dozen specific dates. If so, you're a rare individual. I recall several specific events, but I cannot recall more than a handful of dates, even for dates that, at the time, I thought I'd never forget. Human animals are relatively long-lived, an attribute that contributes to the inability of most of us to remember specific dates a few years later, even for events we considered important. As a point of reference, consider contrasting your life with that of a typical mayfly. This animal has an expected adult lifespan of only 24 hours. The mayfly never asks the question Paul shared with me. Quote, "If you only had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it?" End quote. The mayfly is busy eating and procreating. It doesn't live long enough for its mouth to fully form. The mayfly's priority is underlain by evolution by natural selection, procreation. The mayfly has been stunningly successful. At nearly 300 million years old, it is recognized as the oldest flying insect still alive. There are about 3,000 different species of mayfly, and they are found on every continent except Antarctica. The Ladybug book I co-authored with Pauline featured a dragonfly as a main character. Dragonflies, like mayflies, are also about 300 million years old. As with mayflies, dragonflies have relatively short lives as breeding adults after living much of their lives in water. Back to 24 hours. If you believe a day is a short period of time, consider the mayfly and another better-known invertebrate, the dragonfly. Consider the many other species that persist only a few months or years. Can you live with intention and with gratitude, and therefore make the next 24 hours seem to last a long time? Can you do the same with the next hour? Albert Einstein, upon growing tired of answering questions about his thoughts on relativity, once gave this response, quote, "Put your hand on a hot stove for a minute, and it seems like an hour. Sit with a pretty girl for an hour, and it seems like a minute. That's relativity." End quote. I'm no Einstein. You probably aren't either. Yet we both have the capacity to live fully in the here and now. I encourage you to live with intention and with gratitude, and therefore make the next 24 hours stretch out ahead of us. The concept is a worthy one, as our time draws even shorter. Speaking of Einstein, I'm unable to wrap this short video without a silly joke. I began my college experience as a math major. That's not the joke. The poor instructor of my differential equations course made sure I didn't remain a math major for long. That's not the joke either. The joke is on my shirt, courtesy of friends Beth and Daniel. Here's looking at you, Clyd. See? That's funny, isn't it?